Hello, I'm Layne Hartsell with the Korea IT Times. I'm here with Fabian Scheidler, an artist, philosopher, attended the Free University of Berlin and in theater and directed at the Frankfurt University of Music and Performing Arts. He works and lives in Berlin. He's a writer for print media, television. He's been on Radio France, Le Monde Diplomatique, Berliner Zeitung, and the Frankfurter Rundschau. They also published in The Nation, Jacobin, New Left Review, many others, Common Dreams, and so forth. He's the author of The End of the Megamachine that we'll talk about tonight, The Brief History of a Falling Civilization. He also has exhibitions on what he calls photosynthesis, a photosyntheses, a photomontage, and is the author of the Stuff That We Are Made Of, Rethinking Nature and Society, and also an essay, The Mental Field, Theater Essentials. Welcome, Fabian. Nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, let me talk about how you, first of all, got directed into, say, Mumford and Geddes and this whole work, the Garden Cities. Where did this come up for you, say, as an artist?
Well, I've started as an artist in theater. I studied philosophy and history, and I did a lot of theater and cinema stuff and so on. And then I got involved in the global justice movement in the early 2000s. That was after Genoa and all these events, Seattle. And so that was a time of hope, indeed, because for the first time since the 60s and 70s, movements converged. And I got involved in that. And of course, the idea was that let's get rid of neoliberalism, which was an important issue to overcome this counter-revolution, if you will, or this as others have put it, it's a slow motion corporate coup d'etat, which was going on. And so I was involved in that movement for quite a time. But after a time, I realized that the problems we have are much deeper than neoliberalism. That's just the most recent phase of a system that goes back 500 years. And if you have to go back even further in time to the creation of the first hierarchical power systems, power machines, if you will, 5,000 years ago. And that's, of course, where I came back to Mumford, who has exactly the time frame, 5,000 years, the pyramids, the first hierarchical power machines that were created then. And another important author in those days was David Graeber with his book, Dead, the First 5,000 Years. He had exactly the same time span. So at a given moment, I told myself, well, what we need indeed to understand the roots of the crisis of civilization that we are in, we need like people's history of Western civilization. Some of you might know Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And I talked to my girlfriend then. I said, we need something like that, but for Western civilization. But I cannot do it. We need 10 scholars who work on that for 10 years because it's a big thing to do that. And but at a given moment, I had an idea, because I'm also a dramaturge. So I had an idea how to tell this story without having too many details, without having a book of 2,000 pages, but I had an idea of how to get the complexity, but still have it embedded in a narrative. And so I came up with that book, The End of the Megamachine, A Brief History of a Failing Civilization, which is mainly about the last 500 years, the structures of the megamachine, the capitalist world system, as it has been called by Immanuel Wallerstein and many others. And I go back to the prehistory. So, and this system is not only an economic system, it's political, it's psychological, it's ideological, it's a military system. So we can talk about that later, about the pillars of the megamachine that make up this historical system.
You and Mumford talk about this thing. It's this mechanical apparatus sounding, and the people are the parts. You talk about Dante and, the medieval times. say from Venice up to now, 500 years ago. Can you give us like can you delve into this a little bit so people can understand this machine? Because I think that, when we were in college, we would talk about we don't want to be a cog in the machine, right?
Yeah.
And but we didn't quite know where is this machine, right?
Yeah, the machine, of course, with Mumford and with me, is a metaphor for a social system which is made up of human beings, of living beings. And at the end of the day, it's a living system, as all human societies. But with the emergence of capitalism in the 16th and 17th century, the idea came up in the early science that the world is a machine. It's inseparable from capitalism, indeed, that idea. Uh, First of all, people like Galileo and so on, they were heavily involved in the military-industrial complex, interestingly. They were great scientists, no doubt about it, very important scientists. At the same time, they worked for the powers that be of the times, as Isaac Newton himself. And the idea was the world is a machine. So first of all, the planets are moving like in a clockwork. But later on, people like Descartes came up with the idea that the body is a machine, and later on, the general idea that humans and other living creatures are biological robots, which is very popular until today. Although this idea has been completely refuted in science, in physics, I mean, with Einstein and quantum physics, we know that all these little billiard balls that were supposed to make up the universe do not exist in that way. It's all about relations, it's all about energy. Right. And in systems biology, we also know that nothing of that is linear, but still this idea is prevailing that we can control nature. And I go back in the book also to earlier times when the idea arose that the metaphysical, the spiritual world, is also designed in a way of orders and obedience. So there's a God, a ruling God, which of course is a projection of earthly rule onto heaven. The earthly God commands his folks as a military commander commands his military. So this imagination couldn't happen without the military being in place first. And then in the modern age, this idea was transformed into the idea of the human engineer that can control nature in a linear way. So we're engineering a sort of second creation. That's what all these Silicon Valley people are about today. It's a long tradition. And it's inseparable indeed from the capitalist world system, because the main point of the capitalist world system is to turn nature into a commodity, right, at an ever faster pace. So we have to control nature and we have to control humans. So we have to control the workforce to make them produce more and more stuff at another faster rate. And for that, to achieve that goal, we have to turn them into cogs in a machine. So the metaphor, if you will, that was at the beginning of the capitalist world system has become a reality. People in factories and many other institutions work like cogs in the machine, and that's why they can be replaced by robots, which is now the main point of all this AI stuff and so on.
So the apparatus would be like at the time, like maybe the Leviathan or the King, and then you have this whole structure that goes down and all of these parts. And this thing is very powerful, obviously. So like John Mersheimer would say, this is extremely powerful system. And can you go into which there's a lot of ways I'd like to go with you, right? So we could go the route of Dante, we could go into nature and this mining machine. Let's go. How about if we go that direction? Damnatio et metallo. If I say that to you, what would this bring up?
Well, damnatio et metallo was a punishment in ancient Rome, besides crucifixion and others, that was one of the worst damnations to work in the mines. So metallurgy played a crucial role for the first power systems in history. It started already with the Bronze Age. It's called Bronze Age because a new form of metal was used then, it's quite a complicated procedure for those times. And there was an elite that would master this technology and would control the arms that could be produced with that. And so that was for the first tyranny. I speak in the book of four tyrannies: physical power, structural violence, ideological power, and the tyranny of linear thinking. And so for the first pillar for physical power, mastering the metals was essential because it's the arms industry, the core, the beginnings of the military industrial complex, which is so huge today, 5,000 years of history. And the second relevance of metals was the financial system. So that's the second tyranny, the second pillar of power, which is structural violence, economic power, property relations, and so on. And of course, the first financial systems were based on coins, on silver and gold, mainly silver. And in ancient Greece, the empire of the Greek Empire, the military was based from a certain point on coins. So Alexander the Great could conquer all these territories only because he created a mercenary army. He needed tons of silver for that.
Talk about how that worked. How did that work? Because if you have like say 5,000 men marching across you got to feed them, right? You have to give them some kind of. So how do you do this?
Well, the restriction to the military prior to the invention of coinage was that you needed peasants, and you had to feed the peasants, and the peasants had to return to their fields. Otherwise, there would be no harvest and no food at all. So you were very limited. The scope of military expeditions was very limited. The same problem in the Middle Ages, by the way. Modernity solved it in quite the same way as the ancient Greeks by coinage. And so the idea of coinage is that you don't need the peasants. You have a professional army mercenaries. You have to pay them. But the problem then is, what can they buy for silver? I mean, peasants don't eat silver. They need something in return that they can really use. So the point here was that the state forced the peasants to produce for money. And how did they do that? The taxes, which were formerly taken in kind, were then supposed to be delivered in coins. And so the peasants had to work for the market, the money economy, in order to pay their taxes. But with these taxes, the mercenary armies were paid, who were used to force again the peasants to pay their taxes. So that was a cycle. And also, these mercenary armies could be used for wars which were much greater than the wars before, and they could conquer more territories and slaves that were forced to work in the mines. So we're back at the damnatio ad metallam. This was a cycle of positive feedback loops that propelled the Greek Empire, and the Roman Empire was based on the same system. So these were the ancient empires, and the capitalism used the same mechanisms in the late Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there was a huge shortage of silver, so they couldn't create mercenary armies, and so they were desperate about it. And when they found some silver, they immediately started to create the same cycle. And then the invention of firearms played a crucial role for capitalism, and that changed things dramatically. There was an invention from China, but China didn't use them the same way as the Europeans. In Europe, it became an arms race that has lasted until today. So that's another boost in the military-industrial complex in those days.
Two things. One is you mentioned China, which I'd like to ask you about that. Another is that as you got to the end there, you mentioned that they needed silver. And so in the New World at Potosi in Bolivia, which many people don't know, they have a mountain there that's basically pure silver. Can you talk a little bit about this and how this 500 years ago this happened.
Yeah, first of all, they managed to find some silver in Europe already in the 12th century, 14th century, and that was really the beginning of like industrial mining. It was not industrial in today's sense, but it was already large scale mining. They had a lot of technological problems in those days, and but they reached limits. And then the expansion started with Columbus and others. And the main idea was not only to conquer other territories, but to get silver money for the growing capitalist economy, and for the mercenaries. No, that was the main business. The largest business in those days was war. The richest people were war entrepreneurs, and the magnates, the bankers and merchants in Genoa and elsewhere. They lent money to the states so they could buy mercenary armies and cannons to conquer other territories, and from the booty of these wars, they could repay the return on investment of the merchants and bankers in Genoa and elsewhere. And that was the motor for the colonization of the Americas. And when they arrived in America, they were so hungry for gold and silver that they forced the indigenous population to get some. And in Bolivia, finally, they found Potosi. They founded Potosi and the Silver Mountain, Cerro Rico. Hundreds of thousands of tons of silver were extracted from that mountain. That mountain reduced its height considerably by several hundred meters because they got all the silver out of it. And many people in those days compared these mines to literally to hell. And many depictions of hell have a lot in common with this mountain, with all these fires and the smelters and all the burning and the smells and the poison and the destruction of human lives in these mines. This was literally hell on earth.
The streets are paved with silver in Potosi.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the richest and biggest cities in the world, comparable to Paris and London and others.
Definitely. This is one thing I wanted to talk about with you, because many people think that Europe was like the center of the world and this kind of thing, but actually here's this silver city, literally, in Bolivia.
Yeah, but the Silver City was so part of the emerging capitalist world system. But the silver was also integrated in a larger cycle. Finally, it ended almost all up in China.
In China, right.
Europe had a huge trade deficit with China. The reason was that China was much more developed technologically. They didn't need anything from Europe. The only thing they were interested in is silver because they didn't have enough. And they had experimented, the Chinese government, with the paper money. It didn't work well, so they got back to silver. And so to pay for all these Chinese spices and silk and glass, and which was much better in quality than what Europe was able to produce, the Europeans paid in silver. And so the silver ended up in China.
The ships would come back into Genoa port, or would they just go around the Horn and over straight to China? Was this done by boat?
Both ways. A large part of the silver, of course, went to Cordoba and other Spanish cities, and then to Europe to feed the exploding money economy in Europe. By the way, it was a huge inflation in Europe especially in the 17th century. Real wages dropped dramatically. So all this narrative that capitalism made ordinary people's lives better is a hoax. I mean, it made life much worse for most people for a very, very long period. Some people got very rich and others suffered. And a part of the silver later went also directly to China.
What I hear in this, and I've seen tech people talk about it too. So these were entrepreneurs going out of Genoa, going out of Venice. They were funded by the capitalists that as it was beginning, and then this was a big silver mining. Well, they're looking for gold, but it was actually silver. Some of the tech people say that Columbus was the preeminent entrepreneur, which he was. But is there any problem with this kind of system? Today we have the modern corporation, the
Yeah,
Megamachine.
well, Columbus, that was an early phase of capitalism. These were adventurers,
Okay,
and Columbus, of course, was part of a genocide, and he initiated a genocide consciously. When he arrived at the Bahamas, he already noted in his logbook how we can take these people back to Spain and enslave them, get this. So there was nothing friendly about Columbus arriving there. The fact that he's still considered a hero in much of the United States and other parts of the world is just a travesty of history. He started really to kill thousands of people, enslave them, take them back to Spain, and so on. And all his successors did the same thing at a large scale. It was a huge genocide in those days. Later on, capitalism moved on to more institutionalized forms of subduing the world and extracting resources and silver. The corporations which were founded in 1602 in Amsterdam, the Dutch East India Company, but was the first one. It was a model. And the interesting thing about it was completely new in world history. So it had its own mercenary army. It was like a state, indeed. The corporations were like states. They were created by states. They were given monopolies by states. That's another dirty secret of capitalism, that it has been based on monopolies since the beginning, something that Adam Smith criticized the corporations for. And so these corporations would conquer the world. They would rule about other territories like India. The British East India Company was the government of India, as the Hudson Bay Company, the government of Canada, and so on. North America was colonized by them most of the time, linked to genocides. The interesting thing is that some people in the Trump administration today want to go back to these days when they create these corporate cities. Well,
right.
that's going back hundreds of years to the beginning of the system, when that was all privatized. The East Coast of the US these were private companies running the show. And so they played a huge role in the colonization process and in the genocides. They were heavily militarized. And the problem with all of that in ecological terms is, I mean, in human rights terms, it was a catastrophe from the outset. But in ecological terms, these institutions that were created, they have to grow forever to exist, because they have only one objective, and that is to increase the shareholder value and the return on investment. So it doesn't matter who is the head, the CEO of such a company. The only thing he has to do is to increase the shareholder value and the return on investment. And for that, he has to transform nature into commodities at an ever faster pace. These institutions cannot stop to grow. And the 500 biggest of them, they are responsible for 2/3 of world trade, 40% of global GDP. This is the core, the motor of the machine. And if you install such institutions on a finite planet, you're doomed. These are the main institutions that run the economy. They cannot stop to grow. They cannot stop to drag all resources into them and spit out money. And I think that's the key point that we have to change, which is, of course, a hard thing. People have been trying to do that for centuries, but we have to get to that core. We need different institutions that work for the common good and not for the endless accumulation of capital. They do exist, cooperatives and public services and many others. And so I think we have to get rid of these corporations, not because the CEOs are bad people, because they follow the wrong logic, which will really crash us into an ecological disaster on the planet.
Well, I've been speaking with Fabian Scheidler, philosopher, artist, and thinker from Berlin. and also the author of the Megamachine, which we've been talking about. Maybe I can invite you back and we can talk more about, are we stuck with this thing? So thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.